In this video, we're going to compare the LG C1 on your left versus the Sony A80J on your right to help you decide which 2021 OLED TV you should buy for your needs. LG and Sony have different philosophies in terms of how their respective OLED TVs come out of black. Now the LG C1 would crush a bit more shadow detail near black to suppress near black chrominance overshoot, but its gradation would also be slightly coarser, whereas the Sony A80J would brighten near black gamma to maintain a smoother gradation, but as a result, the shadow detail will look a bit more compressed and lacking in detail as well. This is borne out in real-world content where the LG C1 would have more depth and look less washed out, whereas the Sony A80J would look a bit flatter. And if we watch an HDR10 movie, we are using Arrival here. You can see that even though I have dropped black level to 49 on the Sony A80J, shadow detail still looked a bit more compressed and brighter than what the LG C1 was presenting, because the C1's near black calibration controls are more precise and granular than what's offered on the Sony A80J. Next, we move on to color, and both TVs can be calibrated to a very accurate level. The Sony A80J can be calibrated using Kalman AutoCal. It's just that the 3D light calibration on the LG C1 can achieve even lower delta error figures across the board. While on the subject of calibration, this video is sponsored by UK electrical retailer Crampton Mall, who have started selling pre-calibrated televisions under my supervision. If you are thinking about getting a new TV, even if it's not the LG C1 or Sony A80J, please support this channel by considering buying from them. Call 0113 244 6607, mention HDTV test, and you will receive great price and service. Thanks again for your support. Even with all motion compensated frame interpolation switched off, both televisions presented 24 frames per second movies smoothly without any sign of telecinic judder. Now, because of OLED's near instantaneous pixel response time, some viewers have complained of seeing more frame hold stutter in 24p content. And so for 2021, LG has implemented a new cinematic movement setting which works well to smooth out the 24p stutter. And if we compare cinematic movement versus smoothness 1 on the Sony A80J, Sony's motion flow smoothness 1 will incur a bit more soap opera effect and also more interpolation artifacts than LG's cinematic movement setting. And with higher frame rate content such as 50Hz or 60Hz, both TVs could deploy MCFI or motion compensated frame interpolation and also BFI or black frame insertion together to reach a motion resolution of 1080 lines or even higher. However, Sony's motion flow algorithm is more mature and less glitchy than the True Motion system from LG. For example, in this 50Hz broadcast material off-air, if we engage True Motion on the LG C1 and also motion flow on the Sony A80J, the LG C1 would exhibit some micro stutter, especially during facial movements or hand gestures. And these micro stutter artifacts were not seen on the Sony A80J even with motion flow enabled. When it came to upscaling, overall I think the Sony A80J had the slight upper hand. On this SMPTE RP13 test card in 576i, the Sony A80J presented a cleaner picture with less fizziness. Even though when we switched to real-world standard definition broadcast, we couldn't really see too much of a difference. It is when we moved to high-definition content that the Bravia XR processing on the Sony A80J started to take effect. And in this high-definition broadcast from the BBC, we thought that the Sony A80J just extracted a bit more detail, especially in the sand and also in the character's hair. And if we switch to a 1080p Blu-ray, this is Skyfall displaying Daniel Craig's handsome face. And I thought that the Sony A80J managed to etch out the detail, the wrinkles, the eyebrows, in a slightly clearer fashion than what the LG C1 was capable of. Remember that I was actually using a neutral sharpness setting on both sets. However, sometimes Sony's Bravia XR processing can go a bit overboard, especially in scenes that contain a lot of fine detail, such as the shot from Skyfall, and the Sony A80J looked a bit more processed due to local gamma manipulation that is going on, whereas it looked more natural to my eyes on the LG C1. When it came to video-based interlaced material, the Sony A80J suppressed jaggies slightly better than the LG C1, with the third bouncing bars on the A80J showing less jagged edges than the LG C1. With film mode engaged on both televisions, the LG C1 and also the Sony A80J correctly detected and processed 3:2 and 2:2 cadences in film-based interlaced material. Bright uniformity was excellent on our LG C1 and Sony A80J OLED TV review samples, without any sign of dirty screen effect, color tinting, or banding. And when it came to dark uniformity between these two review units that I have here, the Sony A80J was slightly cleaner near black, possibly because of its brighter near black gamma, although there's still some darker vignetting along the sides of the TV. And I specifically put up this very bright HDR scene to check for Venetian blind effect. And truth be told, these faint horizontal lines were very mild on my review samples, and I genuinely had to walk up and go looking for it before I could spot it. For HDR, on test patterns, the LG C1 measured brighter than the Sony A80J in terms of peak brightness on a 10% window, as well as full field. However, things are not that simple when it came to real-world content because of Sony's always-on dynamic tone mapping and also Bravia XR processing. So for example, if we look at this 1008 movie, Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children, generally the APL is similar between both TVs, but occasionally the Sony A80J would present the clouds in a slightly brighter manner, whereas in another shot the LG C1 would paint the overhead fluorescent lights in a slightly brighter fashion. So I would say that it is neck and neck. When we go to a 4000 nit movie such as Pan, the Sony A80J was able to retain the specular highlight and also keep the saturation better in bright HDR elements, even though its APL or average picture level is slightly darker than the LG C1. Where Sony's Bravia XR processing really made a difference in terms of HDR presentation is in terms of the saturation of very bright HDR elements. And in this Mad Max scene, you can see that the flames were generally more saturated on the Sony A80J compared with the LG C1's rendition, which was more muted, probably because of white subpixel dilution effect. Now, given that the Sony A80J's dynamic tone mapping is always engaged under the hood, we experimented with enabling dynamic tone mapping on the LG C1 to see if we can create a level playing field. However, you can see that the flames remain more muted and the APL looked noticeably darker than the HDR presentation of the Sony A80J. Furthermore, LG's dynamic tone mapping also had a tendency to brighten near black and mid-tones in other middling scenes unnecessarily, thus deviating from creative intent, which is why we usually switch dynamic tone mapping off on LG OLEDs. For gaming, the LG C1 generally had lower input lag than the Sony A80J, both at 60 frames per second and also 120 frames per second, even though the difference is not night and day. Where the LG pulled ahead was in terms of HDMI 2.1 features supported. So the LG C1 already supports ALM and VRR, whereas the Sony A80J is still waiting for a firmware update of indeterminate date. Also, because the LG C1 uses an in-house SoC, it is capable of supporting Dolby Vision gaming at 4K 120Hz, whereas on the Sony A80J, 4K 120Hz gaming and Dolby Vision are mutually exclusive, partly because of the MediaTek SoC used. There are other HDR gaming aspects which went in LG's favor. First is HDRG. Now, LG's HDRG implementation is correct in that it hard clips at 800 nits, whereas with the Sony A80J you have to turn off HDR tone mapping to hard clip, but that will undertrack the EOTF, which means that in the actual gameplay you have to engage gradation preferred to restore the PQ EOTF tracking, but this will also tone map the pre-tone mapped gaming picture even further, so its HDR is slightly less impactful than the properly implemented HDRG in HDRG compliant games such as Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart on the PS5. The Sony A80J also had a tendency of exhibiting some posterization in 4K 120 frames per second HDR games, for example in the skies in Ratchet & Clank. Last but not least, LG's logo luminance dimming system can be turned off completely through the service menu, whereas you couldn't do so on the Sony A80J either in the regular user menu or in the service menu. So for example, if you are playing an HDR game with static elements, I'm using FIFA 19 here, the scoreboard and other static elements on screen will cause the HDR image on the Sony A80J to gradually become dimmer over time due to the auto dimming that is undefeatable on the Sony OLED, because there is no setting in the Sony OLED to disable logo luminance dimming. The tables were turned when it came to SDR gaming though, even though I don't think many AAA titles are going to be in pure SDR anymore. So one advantage that the Sony A80J has over the LG C1 in terms of SDR gaming is in upscaling and detail retrieval. For example, in Genshin Impact, the objects were just rendered in a slightly sharper and clearer fashion on the Sony A80J. And also, if you are playing SDR games in a brighter environment, the Sony A80J can go brighter because the peak brightness setting on the LG C1 is locked and grayed out, whereas it is still accessible on the Sony A80J, allowing you to put out a brighter picture for SDR gaming if you so wish. And this conveniently brings me to bright room performance. The Sony A80J was capable of a slightly brighter SDR picture for daytime viewing due to the Bravia XR processing. And when it came to reflections, our 65-inch A80J review sample sported a semi-matte coating which muted reflections better but also dulled the contrast in the presence of ambient light. So I think the LG C1 will preserve contrast a bit better due to its glossier screen coating in the presence of ambient light. And just to check out the differences between the panels on the LG C1 and also the Sony A80J, for some reason we found that the A80J took longer to clear up image retention. Here I'm displaying a 10% window in HDR at full blast for 10 seconds before switching to a full field gray slide, and the afterglow lingered longer on the Sony A80J. To assess sound quality, I muted the LG C1 and the Sony A80J in turns when playing this scene from The Greatest Showman, and I preferred the audio presentation on the Sony A80J due to its clearer stereo separation and slightly wider soundstage, and I thought that the sound localization was better as well due to the acoustic surface audio plus technology. The bass of the LG C1 could go slightly deeper, but it sounded a bit muddier to me as well compared to what the Sony A80J was delivering. For 2021, the LG WebOS 6.0 and also Sony's Google TV interface are both now full screen. And specific to the UK market, the LG C1 features all the key UK catch-up TV streaming apps such as BBC iPlayer, ITV Hub, and the rest out of the box, whereas BBC iPlayer and certainly ITV Hub were still absent on the Sony A80J at the time we filmed this video in July 2021. To sum up, both the LG C1 and the Sony A80J are excellent 2021 OLED TVs. And which one you should buy depends entirely on, first of all, obviously your budget, but also secondly, depending on what sort of content you're going to be using these TVs for. Now, the Sony A80J has the upper hand in terms of upscaling and also how it deals with low bitrate content. Its HDR presentation is also more impactful due to the Bravia XR processor's ability to depict bright HDR elements in a more saturated manner than what's seen on the LG C1 because of the white subpixel dilution effect. And in terms of its motion interpolation, generally I find that Sony's motion flow interpolation introduced less artifacts or less frame skipping than what you normally see on the LG True Motion algorithm. On the other hand, the LG C1 has the edge in terms of the near black calibration controls, which will allow you to dial in the correct level of shadow detail clarity and luminance. And most importantly, the LG C1 is, superior in terms of the gaming aspects. It supports 4K 120Hz Dolby Vision together. It supports HDIG, whereas, with the Sony A80J, you have to use a workaround to set the HDIG parameters, and even then, it can never reach the HDIG implementation on the LG C1 because the LG C1 will do a proper hard clip with tone mapping off, whereas if you use gradation preferred on the Sony A80J, you will still be introducing some sort of tone mapping into the equation, so you will be double tone mapping HDIG compliant games, so to speak. And this is not to mention that the LG C1 already has VRR support out of the box, FreeSync, G-Sync, whereas, we are still waiting for Sony to roll out a firmware update on the A80J. And even then, we are not entirely sure what consequences there will be because of the limitations of the MediaTek SoC. For example, currently, I already see some posterization in 4K 120 frames per second content in HDR on the A80J because of limitations of the MediaTek SoC that Sony is using on all their HDMI 2.1 televisions, including the A80J. So I think, to make it really easy for you, I think if you are a hardcore gamer who prioritize Dolby Vision gaming, who prioritize 4K 120Hz, HDMI 2.1 features, VRR, G-Sync, FreeSync, and HDIG support, I think, there is no doubt in my mind that the LG C1 is going to be the better TV for you, at least this year. Whereas, if you are more concerned about outright picture quality, not only for movies, but also for general viewing in terms of broadcast programs, then I think, the Sony A80J will be the better choice. And I hope, that makes it clear. If you'd like to watch more of our technical TV comparisons, please click here for our playlist, and I will see you in the next video.